Welcome everyone to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start off with the interesting story that came out at ESPN yesterday. Chris Lowe had a very interesting piece about the 49-hour coaching period, search period that Alabama dealt with after Saban decided to retire. Then we're going to get into some spring ball. There's spring practices coming up very shortly, so we got a ton of questions to answer. And then we'll get into some conference championship odds. We had some odds come out from FanDuel recently, so wanted to break down some different teams up at the top and then some dark horses to watch throughout the year. And then we have a hot take Thursday. This one is very, very hot, and I'm sure there will be plenty of people that disagree with me, but I think that's the fun of it. So definitely a great show, so stick around for the end for that. But before we start, I do want to remind you all that we get a ton of questions throughout the show, and the best way for you to see your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here is to use the link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a super huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all to see your questions on the screen, and we can have a fun back and forth. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. Alrighty, let's jump right in, because Chris Lowe at ESPN had a very, very interesting article about what happened at Bama recently and the coaching search that opened up and the 49-hour period he had to fill that coaching search. So, ton went into this piece. There's a ton of very interesting parts of this piece, but let's go through the highlights real quick. So Greg Byrne apparently in 2022, after that season, was told by Nick Saban that he was slowing down, that there was going to be an end to his career. He wasn't sure exactly when that was going to be, but there were people that were aware that this might be the last run for Saban before going into the 2023 season. So that's kind of an interesting development that we didn't know before. We thought, at least from what we had heard, it was all very sudden and a rash decision in some ways, but obviously Nick Saban doesn't do much things rash, so he obviously took the time to figure out what was best for him, and he finally came to the decision that retirement was what he should do. So, but also a lot of things contributed to that leading up to the very end of his time there. Nick Saban dealt with some interesting reactions after the Rose Bowl that he was not used to. He said he didn't love some of the immediate reactions in the stadium from some of the players, and then it only hurt more when they got back to Tuscaloosa because there were a number of kids, he said about 70 to 80% of the team, that was worried about their starting time next year or how much money they could be making next year, and things that Saban didn't want to worry about. Saban felt like they not necessarily didn't care, I don't want to say that obviously, but I think he was taking it a little bit harder than the rest of the people in the room, and I think that frustrated him a little bit. But he got the feeling that relationships and the things that he has been incredibly good at developing and has kept him in the sport for so long were kind of deteriorating. He felt like they didn't hold the same weight that they used to, and with someone like Saban, that's what he does really well, is create relationships with these guys. So obviously that was something that he was not enthused by any means. He did say that is not necessarily the reason that he retired, NIL, the transfer portal, all of that different stuff, but there were a lot of confounding factors, and that was obviously one of them. So he also felt that replacing the coaches that would walk out of the program every year to get promotions and things of that nature was getting tougher and tougher as he got older and older. So it's not necessarily surprising that all of this happened, but it is interesting to see kind of the last couple of days as he came to make this decision. So, but apparently shortly after that, Nick Saban went on his one vacation of the year, much like other college coaches, and him and the famous Miss Terry that we all love so much, they went down to Florida, and he had some conversations with Bill Parcells and Gene Stallings. Gene Stallings, obviously a Bama legend, and Bill Parcells, one of the most respected coaches in the history of football. So got a lot of advice from very, very good people, and they all basically said there's no right time to retire. There's no right time to hang him up and to decide you're moving on, but you kind of know at a certain point. So he felt like he kind of knew, but he came back to Tuscaloosa, and he went on as business as usual. He kind of did his thing, as Saban does. He kind of handled everything very, very responsibly, very maturely, and went on business as usual because that's the way he works. He's going to work until the very last day. There's no two ways about that. So he kind of went on as business as usual, and the people around him thought it was business as usual with no problem. But eventually he came to the decision, told Greg Byrne, and then the onus was on him. There was a lot of pressure on him, obviously. Replacing someone like Nick Saban is not an easy task by any means. It is remarkably tough to do something like that, and he had to get as much input as possible. So we called guys like Mark Ingram, Joe Namath, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Hurts, all guys that were very important to Alabama, that had played their own part in different kind of eras of Alabama, to just get their thoughts. Not necessarily, give me a name that you really want to be the head coach, but just kind of go through what they thought about what exactly he was replacing, who Nick Saban was on the field, who he was off the field, and what the traits are for the next guy that was going to come through the door. So after those conversations, it seemed that he kind of zeroed in on two guys, Mike Norvell and Kalen DeBoer. So all the talk about, Lane Kiffin or Dabo Sweeney or Steve Sarkisian, none of them were really aggressively considered. It seemed like Steve Sarkisian, the talk around Alabama was just, he's not leaving Texas, so it's not really worth the call. So that totally makes sense. I think it would have taken a lot to pull Sark away from Texas right now as he's kind of heating up. So, but the two real candidates are obviously incredible candidates. Mike Norvell coming off the incredible year that he had with Florida State, and then Kalen DeBoer playing in the national title game against Michigan a year ago. So two incredible names, two guys that I think any team would be happy to have. But it ended up coming down to Kalen DeBoer. But there was a certain amount of time, I don't necessarily know how long, but Florida State upper management, or the athletic department and the people that make the decisions around there, were genuinely worried that he was going to make his way to Tuscaloosa, Mike Norvell, that is. So they had started making some different plans of who their next head coach was going to be, because, as we know, all of this has to happen very, very quickly in today's age. So they had zeroed in, apparently, on none other than Lane Kiffin to possibly take over Florida State if he had left. That would have been a very weird world. We would have been dealing with a lot of different transfer portal news and things happening that none of us had foreseen going into the offseason. So very, very interesting what if there. But Mike Norvell eventually decided to stay in Tallahassee. He got a massive raise, much like Steve Sarkisian and Dan Lanning did while all of this news came out. But it looked like for a second there, Lane Kiffin could have been the next Noles head coach, which would have been very interesting to say the least. But DeBoer really had no idea that this was any of this was happening behind the scenes. Obviously, you're all the way up in Washington. You don't necessarily have ties to Alabama, so no reason that he would necessarily know that Saban was considering retirement. So he got a call on Wednesday and took the job on Friday. So just to give everyone an idea of how quickly all this stuff happens, it was Wednesday was first contact, Thursday was the interview, and then Friday he was offered and accepted the job. So all of this happened very, very quickly, and all of it kind of had to happen quickly. And DeBoer talked about that in this article as well, where he didn't want to leave Washington the way that he left. He didn't necessarily envision leaving Washington this offseason, but when someone like Bama calls, you take the call and you at least give it some real thought, because even taking over for Saban, which is a job that is incredibly tough, that I think there are a number of coaches across the country that would have said no, that would have kind of shied away from the challenge. But as DeBoer said to Chris Lowe in this article, he just couldn't say no to the challenge. So it gives you an idea of who they're getting. Bama in Kalen DeBoer, he is a guy that is obviously not afraid of anything. He is taking on what possibly is the toughest situation in all of sports right now, which is taking over for the best coach of all time in Saban. So a lot of very, very interesting points in this article, a lot of different turns. Lane Kiffin going to Florida State would have been one of the weirder turns of this offseason and would have made this coaching cycle that's already been off the walls even crazier. But some general thoughts about this. Saban was Saban up until the very end. He refused to stop working. He refused to take a chill day off and think about retirement. He came right back in and he started to go to work again like business as usual. And that's what Tommy Rees said. He didn't feel like there was any difference really with the way he's going about business. And that's why he's the best to ever do it. There is certain people that will never let outside stuff kind of affect what's going on in the building. And Saban was never going to let that happen. So it was very, very cool, obviously, and shows you who he was and what he was to this sport. And then on the Greg Byrne side, the Alabama AD, he was put in an impossible situation. I think everyone across the country that is an athletic director or just a decision maker in these athletic departments did not necessarily praise Greg Byrne's position in this, because it's nearly impossible. But he did a remarkable job dealing with all this. Remarkable turnaround, obviously. 49 hours is not easy amount of time to replace the GOAT, but he was able to do it. Took suggestions from former players that all of the Alabama fans love and can support, so I think that's a huge plus. And then he got an absolute dude in Kalen DeBoer. He got a dude that can obviously coach with the best of them, has had great success, and has made his way up from the NAIA ranks very quickly, way quicker than most people do. I think about a decade ago, he was an NAIA coach, and now he is the Alabama head coach. So just to give you an idea of how incredible this journey has been for Kalen DeBoer and the type of person he is. It is not easy to get promotions in this sport, and Kalen DeBoer able to do it as quickly as he has just been remarkable to watch. But the most interesting piece of news, and the one that everyone is always talking about now, is Lane Kiffin possibly at Florida State. If that were to happen and Mike Norvell went on to Alabama, first of all, Bama would be getting a great head coach in Mike Norvell. I don't think there's any question about that. But also, there's a real reality where a lot of guys that are currently in Oxford, Mississippi would have made their way down to Tallahassee. I think Jackson Dart chief among them. He would have been probably on the first plane down there because so much of his success has been tied to Lincoln Riley in that offense. So it would have been a very different spring. We would have been dealing with a lot of different players bouncing around to a lot of different places. But everything worked out the way it worked out. Kalen DeBoer is the head coach of Alabama, and I think it's a great hire. I think they nailed it. I've said this a number of times. We don't know if he's going to succeed. I know he's a very confident person. I know he's real with his players. I know he's up for the challenge, but you never know if someone's going to succeed until they get into the job, right? It's impossible to really get an idea of what the future looks like at Alabama, but you know you have a guy that's not afraid of this challenge, that's not going to hesitate in making decisions that need to be made, and you got one of the best football coaches in all of the country. So I think there's a ton to like about this hire. We obviously won't know until the games start what is going to happen with all of this, but as of right now, I would feel very good if I was a Bama fan. And then finally, there was obviously a lot of transfer portal stuff, and Kalen DeBoer said that's, obviously not what you want to deal with, but he thinks they have a lot of really good guys in the building that can help them succeed right away. And I think the main guys that were touched on in this article and, deserve a ton of respect because they stayed in Tuscaloosa, because that's not necessarily an easy decision to make with a ton of coaches leaving and a lot of things changing, but Jalen Milroe, Malachi Moore, Tyler Booker, Jahad Campbell, Deontay Lawson, all of these guys sticking around in Alabama and being the leaders of this team going into this year gives Kalen DeBoer a massive leg up on anyone else that was going to take this job, because Jalen Milroe, to start, obviously the leader of the offense, the leader of the team in a lot of ways, and then Malachi Moore, probably the leader of the defense in a lot of ways. So it's incredible to have, at the very least, a number of guys on either side of the ball that have this love for Alabama and this love for the city of Tuscaloosa and want to, wear the crimson for the rest of their college career. So although, Kalen DeBoer is taking over a remarkably hard job and kind of put in an impossible position, he has tons of support from his players and, the leaders on this team. And I think at the very least, he's set up very well to succeed as quickly as possible. So a ton of very interesting things came out of that article. I think a lot of people were not expecting the Lane Kiffin at Florida State possibility, but at the end of the day, coaching searches are all over the place, and they're going to go a number of different directions. So not necessarily surprising there were some twists and turns that we didn't know about. But that'll do it for this segment, and we will come back here after a little break and talk about some questions going into spring. There is a ton of change, like we just talked about, and there's a ton of questions for all the teams out there that are either changing conferences or changing coaches. So we will talk about all the questions that we have right after this.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Nick Saban article and all of the twists and turns that happened in that 49-hour period between the Nick Saban retirement and the hire of Kalen DeBoer. Tons of stuff we did not expect, but now we will get into some questions going into spring. There is a wild turn of events in college football over the last couple of months. There's been a ton of portal entries. There's been a ton of coaching changes. There's been a couple of teams that are thinking about leaving their conferences. So there's been a ton of stuff happening in college football, and there's a ton of questions going into spring. And I think this will likely be part one of many parts of this series because there are a ton of questions that I have that will not be answered in one segment. But let's start with the obvious one. It's the post-Saban era in Tuscaloosa. We just talked about it, and how much of a step does Bama lose? Or do they lose one at all? I guess is the big question, because there are a lot of people that just assume they're going to fall off a cliff because Saban isn't there. And to be fair, I can't necessarily argue with them in some ways because losing a coach like that is impossible to replace. There's no one that can live up to Saban. I don't think there's anyone alive that can pull off what he was able to pull off at Bama. But at the end of the day, you got a great hire, and everything is kind of moving in the right direction in terms of you have the leaders in the room that you want. You have the coach that seems to have a good grasp on the team and what this job kind of entails. But there are a lot of question marks, right? You had a lot of guys portal out, mainly Caleb Downs and Isaiah Bond. Downs going to Ohio State and Isaiah Bond finding his way to Texas. Both of those guys are huge losses. I don't think there's any argument about that. Caleb Downs, in my opinion, is the best player in football. He was the best player on their defense a year ago, leading tackler. And then Isaiah Bond was their leading reception leader a year ago. So two guys that are huge losses. There's no two ways about that. But all of these losses, all of these people portaling out, kind of gives Bama a central message. It gives them something to kind of rally around, and it's essentially the classic, you're either with us or against us. So all these guys that portaled out, it's not necessarily they have a ton of bad blood against them by any means, but I think there is a certain level of, okay, you want to leave, then we'll prove you wrong and, continue what Bama has been for a really long time. So I think there is, some good energy around there, no doubt about it. Apparently, the first couple of practices in spring or at least winter conditioning have been really good. Apparently, the energy has been really, really high. The one very interesting aspect of this is he has let media back into the practices, which is not something Saban would even dream of doing. So obviously a different approach from the guy that was there before, but not necessarily the wrong approach by any means. So it'll be very interesting to see how this spring develops for them. There is no definitive answer for sure in this spring because we won't really know how this team looks until they take the field and until we get probably a year or a year and a half into Kalen DeBoer's tenure, because a lot of the knocks on him throughout the industry and mostly Bama haters has been he can't recruit. So we'll find out very quickly if he can this spring and then going into this summer. He has a ton of guys around him that are incredible recruiters, but you do need the head coach to be as good as anyone. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that develops throughout the spring and then into the season, obviously. And then one of the biggest questions on everyone's mind is there are a ton of teams moving a ton of different places. There is OU and Texas going to the SEC, USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington to the Big Ten, and then Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, Utah to the Big 12. And then if that wasn't enough, we have Stanford, Cal, and SMU joining the ACC. So that's a ton of stuff, obviously, but how are these teams going to fare is the bigger question, because there are a ton of question marks within those teams, but also you're joining a conference that you haven't played a lot of these teams maybe ever, or at least in a very long time. So a ton of very interesting matchups are on the way. But let's touch on all of these teams and kind of go quickly through all of them and just kind of give an idea of what their season could look like and possibly should look like. For Texas, it's all systems go in the first year of the SEC. I think anyone would tell you that they're currently the second in betting favorites to win the conference. So there are a ton of people that have a ton of faith in Texas. It's a rather favorable schedule. They do have to go to Michigan, but if you're going to go to the Big House at any point, I think next year might be the best time to catch it. So there's a ton to look forward to for Texas in this first year in the SEC, but SEC is a ton different than the Big 12. It is a ton harder week by week, so it'll be interesting to see how they respond and if they can build off what they did a year ago. And then OU, kind of the other side of the coin from Texas. Tons of very good stuff about this team, but at the end of the day, OU plays a remarkably tough schedule. There is no one that got a shorter straw really in the SEC than Oklahoma. New quarterback in Jackson Arnold finally getting full starters reps throughout the year. And then the O-line is going to be a big question mark throughout the spring. There are a ton of guys that found their way out. Caden Green, the main one, finding his way to Missouri. So they got a ton of guys to replace, and they have to be able to replace them quickly, or the offensive line is going to get dominated and they won't win a ton of games, I'll be honest. But in my eyes, I think 8-4 or better is a win for the Sooners. I know that's not necessarily what Sooner fans want, but Vegas currently has the win total at 7.5, so I think 8-4 would be more than fine. And then you keep trying to build under Brent Venables. But let's get to the Big Ten teams. We have USC. I tend to believe they're going to have a little bit of a tough time, but the schedule is favorable. So if Lincoln Riley can pull off this flip that he's talking about, if he can pull off this, attitude flip that his teams have kind of struggled, being a little bit softer than other teams, being a little bit worse on defense, if he can, build up this new persona that he wants to very quickly, USC could make some noise. I just tend to believe it's going to take a little bit longer than one season to get all that into place. So I tend to believe USC is going to have a tough time, but they're an interesting team to watch for sure. For UCLA, it's going to be a building year most likely. Joining the Big Ten does not necessarily help the win-loss record at the end of the day, but you're breaking into Sean Foster as your first head coach in his first year after Chip Kelly left for Ohio State. So in my eyes, as long as you're playing better football in Week 13 than you were in Week 1, I think that's a huge win. I think you keep rolling and keep trying to build what I think Deshaun Foster is going to be very successful at building down there at UCLA, because the dude has a lot of passion for the university, for the players, was a former player himself. So I really like him. I think he's going to do a lot of really good work, but this year might be a little bit tougher than the years to come. And Oregon is kind of in the Texas position. Everything is on the table for Oregon. I think they're one of the top 4 teams in the country. They'll be right up there with Ohio State for the Big Ten, but a lot of things are going to change. I think their schedule is going to get considerably tougher from top to bottom, and we'll see how they handle that. So they're kind of the Texas of the Big Ten this year, where everything's on the table, but you got to take advantage, and we'll see what they can do. And then Washington, kind of in a reset year. They have Will Rogers at quarterback, the Mississippi State legend, and then Jed Fish taking over at head coach. Obviously can put competitive teams on the field pretty much no matter what. The year at Arizona started very weird, and then Noah Fafita took over and everything flipped. But the problem is Noah Fafita did not follow him to Washington, so I think this is going to be a little bit of a reset year, a little bit of a rebuilding year for the Huskies, but they're capable of a lot of things, and we know Will Rogers can sling the rock like no other. So I think they could definitely make some noise. They're kind of like USC, where don't necessarily expect a lot, but there's definitely a chance that Washington can make some noise if they can keep that train rolling. And then Utah, Arizona heading to the Big 12. They should be among the top teams in the Big 12 throughout the year. I think they are going to be 2 of the teams to beat in a lot of ways. I think Kansas State's right up there with them, and Kansas State gets Arizona in week 3. So there's a ton to look forward to with this conference. I love this conference, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think Utah and Arizona are the 2 teams coming over from the Pac-12 that can make some real noise this year. And then Colorado, I think they can make noise. I think they have the ability. They obviously have the talent at quarterback and wide receiver and a lot of the skill positions, but that O-line is still a problem. They portaled in a lot of guys. They got Jordan Seaton as a very talented freshman, but I don't necessarily expect it to all be hunky-dory on week 1. So I think Colorado's going to have a little bit of a tough time, but there's still ability there. And in a conference like the Big 12, a lot is on the table. So it'll be interesting to see if the Buffs can make any noise in Deion's second year. And then ASU, Arizona State, still kind of building under Kenny Dillingham. I think this is going to be a good team going into even 2024 and going forward especially, but they could definitely be a team that spoils a lot of people's fun throughout the conference, because very talented Jaden Rashada going into his second year, so a ton of talent on that team, but they haven't quite put it together in terms of getting a ton of wins on the field. So I think it's going to be a tough year, but they could spoil some people's fun for sure. And then the ACC teams, Stanford and Cal are going to have a tough time. I don't think there's any real argument about that. Stanford, I think, is last in odds to win the conference. Cal towards the bottom. SMU is an interesting one, though, coming off a great year where they were one of the top group of 5 teams throughout the entire year, and I think they're a team that could make some noise. I'm not necessarily sure they will, because jumping up to the Power 5 level is obviously a huge jump, but they can do anything with the talent that they have in that room and the guys that they had from a year ago that are coming back. So definitely someone to watch there in the ACC with the SMU Ponies. But let's keep moving here. I think the big question, especially in Columbus, Ohio, is, can Ryan Day answer the bell? There is a ton of questions around him. Can he win the big games? He's lost 3 in a row to Michigan. It just can't be 4. I think every Ohio State fan would tell you that. If it ends up being 4, he is going to be in trouble. That seat is going to get much hotter very quickly. Adding Chip Kelly is huge. Adding Will Howard as a quarterback is huge. Caleb Downs, I said, is the best player in the country in my eyes, so that's obviously huge. So there's a ton to like about this team, and they've done an incredible job being kind of off-season champions, if you will, but no one really cares about off-season champions, especially the people in Columbus, Ohio. So if Ohio State can't, get everything in order in this spring and then make a title run, because they really do have to make a title run, whether it's winning the Big Ten and getting into the playoff, or sneaking into the playoff and making a run, Ryan Day has to prove that he can win big games. He can win big-time playoff games. He can get to he's been in a national title game, but kind of got rolled. But I think there's a ton of ability there. There's a ton to like about this Ohio State team, but Ryan Day is the one that's going to get all of the hate if things go poorly. So I think he's someone that has as much pressure on him as anyone, and this spring at least will give us an idea of what this season could look like for Ohio State. And then Florida State, a team that has been the talk of the town since the end of last season, with the playoff stuff, with battling the ACC, with all of these different things that has been surrounding Florida State. The question is, how do they deal with all that stuff? How do they deal with being snubbed out of the playoff that I think they should have been in? How do they deal with possibly leaving the ACC before the season starts? How do they deal with the expectations that come with, you were an undefeated team going into postseason of last year, got kind of rolled by Georgia, and a lot of people were not singing your praises. A lot of people were very, very dismissive of the season you had. So how do you use that is the real question. Obviously lost a ton of guys. Jared Verse, Braden Fisk on the defensive side are huge losses. And then obviously Jordan Travis, the quarterback, you can't replace him. On the field, it's going to be really tough. Off the field, it's downright impossible because the leader he was is just really, really hard to replace. But DJ Uiagalelei is a very, very talented guy, is a guy that obviously has a great head on his shoulders, which helps a ton. So I think if you're going to replace him with anyone, I think they did a great job replacing him. And then lots of transfers coming in. This is something Mike Norvell is very used to by now at Florida State, but a lot of these guys got a hit, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Roydell Williams, Malik Benson, and Terrence Ferguson, all coming over from Alabama. Pretty much all of them have to hit, because if they don't, it could be a little bit of a letdown season for Florida State. So I think this spring will show us a lot just how those transfers and how all of that stuff is kind of working out in Tallahassee. And then finally, the playoff is expanding. So the question is, what are some teams that can sneak in even if they play the way they have been for the last decade during the playoff era? And I think the number one team, we talked about them yesterday, I believe, was Penn State. They can have another 10-2 year and sneak in. I guess it's a step forward if you're a Penn State fan. I don't know how happy they would be if they went 10-2 and then lost in the first round of the playoff, but you can get in. You can definitely get into the dance with a vintage 10-2 year from Penn State. So don't necessarily need to heighten the level of play, just need to, get into the dance and then see what happens. And then a couple of teams from the SEC that everyone's watching are Ole Miss and Tennessee. I think Ole Miss, especially with the massive portal class they brought in, I think the chance to strike is right now. I think there are a ton of teams that obviously have a good situation going into this season in the SEC, but Ole Miss has a ton going for them. Obviously, Jackson Dart is going to be huge in this, but I think Ole Miss has a chance to sneak in, and then with the offense that they're going to have, they can do a number of things. And then Tennessee, breaking in Nico Iamaleava is going to be tough. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but if you can make him kind of the Hendon Hooker of the 2024 season, you're going to be dangerous. Everyone knows that Josh Heupel, with a really good quarterback, is a scary guy to deal with. So I think Nico can be that guy. I think he's capable, but there's still a big question mark there. So I think we'll learn a ton this spring. Kansas State is a team in the Big 12 that I really love, that I think could sneak in just by winning the conference. They would get an automatic bid there. So I think there's a ton to like about this team. I think the game against Arizona in Week 3 will be a huge indicator. Utah's another team to watch, as we talked about earlier. And then a couple of teams that are off the map a little bit. USF, South Florida, is a major dark horse. I think they're a team in the group of 5 that could find their way in via that auto bid, with Alex Golish and company kind of turning up the heat in South Florida and kind of making them a real team to deal with. And then Texas State's a very interesting team. G.J. Kenney and the staff over there brought in Jordan McLeod at quarterback, which is huge. He had an incredible year for JMU a year ago, so I think there's a lot to like about both those teams, but only one of them can get in most likely. So it's going to be a really fun field. I think there's some debate whether it'll lead to more parity or just a longer time to get to the same teams like Georgia, Alabama, all the teams that we're used to. But at the end of the day, it's more football, and I can't necessarily argue with that. So tons of questions going into this spring, tons of answers that will have to happen throughout this spring. But for right now, that's all I got. We will definitely come back to that. There are so many questions that I didn't even get a chance to answer in this one. So let me know if you have any questions, and maybe I'll get into them in the next segment. But for right now, we are going to take a little break, and then we will come back with conference title odds. FanDuel released their odds for the 2024 season, and there are some very interesting takeaways that I'd like to go through. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the questions heading into spring and some of the teams that are under a lot of pressure heading into the 2024 season. But now it's time to talk conference title odds, because FanDuel recently released their odds for the 2024 season, and there are a lot of interesting takeaways from it that I want to get to. And we'll start with the ACC. We'll go through the four big conferences that remain after the Pac-12 dissolved a year ago. But the ACC is very interesting this year. I think there are a ton of teams that have a chance to jump in, but at the end of the day, the two top teams are no different. Clemson and Florida State are setting the pace at plus 280. I think both those teams are going to be very good this year. I'm a little surprised Florida State isn't just a little bit above Clemson, but can't argue with that. I mean, Clemson has always been in the conversation, so I think it makes a lot of sense. And then they're followed up by Miami at plus 450 and then Louisville at plus 470. So two teams that can definitely make some noise. Cam Ward obviously coming over to Miami is a huge help to them. And Louisville coming off that year where they went to the ACC title game. Still a lot of energy around there, a great transfer portal class. So a ton to look forward to. And then there's quite the drop-off. And then you get to North Carolina State, SMU, Virginia Tech, some other teams that could make some noise. As I said before, Stanford is all the way at the bottom, and I don't think they will make it all the way to the top, I'll be totally honest, so we won't waste too much time on them, but there is a chance that this is one of the more interesting conferences in the country, because we know that Florida State and Clemson are up top. We know that those are the teams to beat pretty much every year right now in the ACC, but we don't necessarily know that Florida State is going to be able to replace all the guys that they have to replace. We don't necessarily know if Clemson is going to continue to fall, if they're going to be able to right the ship over the last couple of years. So if those things happen, if Florida State does have kind of a drop-off from a year ago, if Clemson continues to fall like the last couple of years, the door's open for teams like Miami, NC State, Louisville, all these teams that are just on the outside looking in that could definitely make some noise. And Miami and NC State are the main teams that I'm watching kind of from the lower levels of this conference to kind of make a run at the title possibly. And then another team a little bit off the beaten path, a little bit further down the list is Georgia Tech, mainly because of Haynes King. I think with him returning and the knowledge that he has of the playbook and his ability to run it, as we saw last year, all very, very good and all make him a super big asset for Georgia Tech. So although there is a ton of talent on these other teams, although, Georgia Tech will not be the most talented team in the ACC by any means, they might have the quarterback that has the best handle on his offense. So when you have that, you can do a ton of things. So I think the ACC is very interesting. I think there's a ton of teams that can make runs, but at the end of the day, it's Florida State and Clemson and then everyone else for the most part. And then the Big 12. This is what I think is going to be the craziest conference a year from now. I think We have Utah leading the way at plus 340, followed very closely by Kansas State at plus 360. Those are the two teams that I talked about a second ago. Those are the two teams that have a very, very good chance of being at the top of the conference. And then they're followed up by some very fun teams. Kansas, all the way up at third in the conference at plus 650. A team that is very interesting to watch. Jalen Daniels coming back for another year is huge. And then you have Arizona at plus 750 and Texas Tech at plus 850. All three of those teams can make some noise, but some things got to break their way. There's no doubt about that. But this league really goes 10 deep until you see a very steep drop-off in odds. So this is obviously a very deep conference. We have West Virginia at plus 1,900, and then you have Colorado all the way down at plus 4,000. So that's really the big drop-off, but that's at 10 and 11 in the conference. So there are a ton of teams that can make some noise. I think the Iowa State Cyclones are a very interesting team. Rocco Becht is going to be among the best quarterbacks in the conference. This is a very strong quarterback conference, honestly, and he's going to be right in the thick of it because he's coming off a very, very solid year and will continue to build, I'm sure. And then Colorado is obviously a major dark horse for a number of things this year. Shedeur Sanders might be the best quarterback in the entire conference. I tend to believe he is. So with that, you can do a number of things, but he's got to have time to see the field before all hell breaks loose behind him. So I think the offensive line will be the defining factor there. And then UCF is another team to watch. I think they built up a lot of momentum last year under Gus Malzahn, and I think they can possibly take that into this year. So I think the Big 12 did a really good job replacing two of their biggest brands in Texas and Oklahoma. Obviously, not necessarily the firepower that Texas and Oklahoma have, but it's going to be a super fun conference, and I can't wait to watch what happens out there. And then the Big Ten. Two of the big conferences are the Big Ten and the SEC. So let's start with the Big Ten. We have Ohio State all the way up top at plus 155, and then followed shortly by Oregon at plus 250. Then Michigan plus 460 and Penn State at plus 600. All these teams have a very, very good chance to make a run in the conference, but Vegas doesn't necessarily think that anyone else has a very good chance. I think this is a relatively straight-up conference this year. Even though it's one of the more powerful conferences in the game, I think Oregon and Ohio State are setting the pace out there. I don't think there's any argument about that. And then you have Michigan and you have Penn State, and both those teams can make runs if Michigan's defense is who they usually are. Having Will Johnson back is huge. And then Drew Aller, if he can burst onto the scene at Penn State, there's a lot of things to like about that Penn State team. So definitely a team to watch. I think USC, as we talked about earlier, could definitely make some noise. A relatively easy schedule. Getting Michigan this year is probably as good a year as you can get them. So if they can win that game, the sky's the limit. And then Iowa's offense could always arise from the dead. Who knows? There's always that chance that Iowa's offense meets their defense and they become one of the big-time players in the Big Ten. It's just been a while since that happened. And then can Will Rogers bring Washington back up to the top after a year where a lot of people didn't necessarily expect a ton and they burst onto the scene? I think it's a lot like this upcoming year, so maybe they'll do it again. But let's jump into the last conference here, the SEC. And as we all know, Georgia's the team. They are the team to catch. Kirby Smart is the coach that I think everyone wants in college football. So Georgia leads the way at plus 185, followed by Texas at plus 300. Those are the two big ones. And then there's a slight drop-off, and then you have kind of two groups that are starting to form. Ole Miss, Bama, and LSU. Ole Miss at plus 65, and then Bama and LSU at plus 95. And then you have Tennessee, Missouri, and A&M. Tennessee at plus 1,100, Missouri at plus 1,500, A&M at plus 2,000. So all of those teams can make a run. Obviously, some teams lower on the list have some stuff that needs to break their way. So I think one of the major things that could break these teams' way is, what if Texas doesn't respond to the conference very well? Obviously, they have a lot of things going for them, but it's a very different world they're walking into in the SEC. So I think Texas, if they don't respond well to the new conference, the door is wide open. And it's wide open for guys like Missouri and Tennessee that can make a ton of noise. A&M, another team that has a ton of talent, bringing in a new coach in Mike Elko. So there's a lot to look forward to with all three of these teams. All three of these teams have a chance to make a run, but I think some stuff has to break their way, and I think Texas would be the first domino to fall in that. The SEC is kind of, I think it looks like it's kind of known from the outside. I think a lot of people are expecting Georgia and Texas to be the teams at the end of the day, but there are so many teams that have the chance to strike when the iron is hot and kind of get into the picture if some things go wrong. If, Georgia struggles a little bit with replacing some of the cornerback and safety talent that they've had to, and the wide receivers, and replacing Brock Bowers is no easy task. So a lot of things have to, break the way of Missouri and Tennessee and A&M and those types of teams, Ole Miss among them. But at the end of the day, if they do, all these teams are very, very good and very, very keen to strike. So I think there's a lot of teams to watch. Kentucky's another one that is off the beaten path, but if they can put it together, Mark Stoops can win a ton of games. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this comes to fruition. Obviously, these odds will change throughout the spring, so we'll definitely keep an eye on them. But right now, those are the things I'm watching. There's a ton of teams throughout every conference. I think the Big 12 will be the most off the walls, but the SEC will definitely give it a run for its money. So a ton to like about these conferences, but I think that's all the reactions I have, at least for the time being, on those odds. But we're going to take our final break here, and when we come back, it's Hot Take Thursday. And I think this one's a doozy. I think there would be a lot of people that don't necessarily agree with me too much, but I do have some backing for what I'm about to say. So stick around after this break. We will get into that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the conference title odds and all of the interesting things that is going on around there. FanDuel just released their odds, and there were some very interesting takeaways that we just got into. But now it's Hot Take Thursday, and it's a doozy. So I think Texas and OU is the best rivalry in college football, and I want to start this with a little bit of honesty, a little trust tree here. I am a Texas fan, so a lot of that factors into how I feel about this game, how I kind of identify with this game, but I really do believe this is the truth, and I do have some evidence to kind of back up my idea, but I'm sure there will be a ton of people that disagree with me on this. But the way I look at it, college football rivalries are special for a number of reasons, but I've kind of narrowed down 5 things that every single elite rivalry in a lot of sports, but especially college football, has. And it's historic teams, an intense rivalry throughout the years, so back and forth, or, throughout the entire year, anyone can win any single year, a remarkable atmosphere in and out of the stadium, iconic moments, and then true hatred. You gotta hate the team that's in front of you. Those are the rivalries that we love the most. So let's start with historic teams. You don't get much more historic than Texas and OU. 2 blue bloods in college football, 2 teams that are top 10 in wins, are top 10 in most categories when it comes to college football history. So 2 teams that have a ton of history to them, have a ton of incredible moments in their past, and are the cream of the crop when you talk about college football. So I don't think there's any argument that these are 2 of the best and most historic teams in the sport. And then competitive and intense rivalry. Texas leads the series 63-51-5. There have been different times where one team has dominated and one team, has struggled. Obviously, the 2010s belonged to Oklahoma. They were all Oklahoma pretty much every single year. But as you kind of have noticed, I think if you watch this game, anyone can win any single year. Texas in 2018 was a crazy upset that no one expected to happen. And then OU a year ago, I think a lot of people going into that game had pegged Texas as the winner, almost penned them in as the winner of that game. But OU came in and really dominated that game for a certain majority of it and kind of gave it to Texas for a good portion of that afternoon. So I think that checks off another box for Texas OU being among the best in rivalries in college football. The atmosphere is really where it all kind of separates. I think Texas and OU is college football. I think that rivalry in that atmosphere especially is as perfect as a college football game can get. 50-50 splits happen across the country. Obviously, Georgia-Florida is a big one in Jacksonville where they do have a 50-50 split, but 50-50 splits down the 50-yard line, so one side of the field is a home game and one side of the field is an away game. That's not so normal. That is not something that teams deal with very often. They obviously are used to having fans on one side and fans on the other, but it's not usually you're dealing with rowdy fans that hate you on one side and then fans that love you on the other. So it's a very interesting atmosphere for that reason. I think that's really what mainly separates it. And then if you go outside the stadium, you have the Texas State Fair. And I think there are a lot of people that would tell you fried food and football just go together like peas and carrots. I don't think there's any question about that. So I think the Texas State Fair is the perfect surrounding feature to this game. It brings so many people into that atmosphere, into the kind of tailgating atmosphere that they've brought to that game, and there's so many incredible things to do there. And then you get to walk in to the stadium, see a great game, and then come right back out and have a funnel cake, whether it's in victory or defeat. I think it's just an incredible thing to surround that game that's already so incredible. And then let's get into some iconic moments, because this one has plenty of them. There has been plenty of crazy moments and moments you will see on plenty of YouTube mixtapes with highlights from college football games throughout the year. Whether it's Jordan Shipley's kick return in 2008, Stoney Clark stonewalling James Allen on the goal line to give Texas the win in 94, Baker returning to the team that didn't recruit him and kind of beating the crap out of them for 4 years. And then you have Dicker the kicker becoming a legend of the game in 2018. And then you have Caleb Williams bursting onto the scene in 2021. So tons of moments, tons of guys being born in this game, being kind of enshrined into history in this game. Mainly Baker has been one of the big legends of this game throughout its history. So I think that checks another box. I don't think there's any question that iconic moments happen across pretty much every single game that these two teams play. And then that comes to the final one, true hatred. That is the one that makes everyone happy, that makes everyone giddy about this game, and makes everyone giddy about most rivalry games across college football. And it's the one I can speak to the most, because I'll be honest, every time I wake up on that first weekend of October, I wake up with a little bit more energy. I won't lie. I wake up with a little bit of anger in my heart, a little bit of my blood boiling, because it's the day we play Oklahoma. There's always some energy in the building when Texas plays Oklahoma, and I know that very well. So there has been plenty of hatred throughout the history of these schools, even to the point where Darrell K. Royal, one of the Texas legends, accused a Oklahoma legend, Barry Switzer, both incredible coaches, of stealing signs and wanted him to take a lie detector test in 1976. So there's plenty of hatred. There's plenty of anger between these two teams, even up to the coaches' ranks, and it goes back a really, really long time. I think this game is right up there with a number of other iconic rivalries in the game. Obviously, Ohio State, Michigan, the game is right up there at the top. The Iron Bowl, another one, Alabama, Auburn. So I think anyone has different orders for those three games. I think those are the three that kind of set the pace for college football in a lot of ways. But when I look at the atmosphere at the Red River shootout showdown, rivalry, whatever you want to call it, there's something different about that. I think it is college football in its most pure form. I think the fans there have just a little bit more energy than they do in other places. I think there's a little bit more hatred in that room when you get up to game week. I think there's a lot of energy around this game. There's no two ways about that. And I think it kind of sets itself apart by the atmosphere once you walk into the stadium, because it is not very often where you have a goal line stand and you're getting booed on the offensive side, and then you go to the other side of the field after halftime and you're getting cheered as you try to go in the end zone. So it's a very interesting diatribe between the two sides of that field. It's a very interesting world in Dallas for that week leading up to it. But I think it's one of the best rivalries. I think it's the best rivalry in college football. I think it's one of the best rivalries in all of sports. I think it's as good as it gets. I think once it's on, the bigger stage that is the SEC, I think more people are going to love it. More people are going to experience what it's like, and more people are going to realize that this is different than anything else in college football. I think, in my eyes, it's the most pure form of college football. It is as perfect of an atmosphere as you can possibly have, all the way down to the Cotton Bowl being a little bit disheveled and run down throughout the years. But I think this one's special, and I think a lot of people will either have already believed that for a long time or are going to come to that belief very shortly, because this one is about to get a lot more press when it gets into the SEC and has that 3:30 slot on ESPN now. So a ton to like about this game. I think it's the best rivalry in college football and probably top 10 in all of sports, because there's something special about that atmosphere that doesn't exist anywhere else in sports. I'll be totally honest. But that'll do it. That'll do it for this edition. I think this was a great show. So thank you all for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a ton to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a positive review. It makes a huge difference for us here at the channel. But also follow on all of our social pages on Facebook, Twitter, or X, TikTok, Instagram for all the content and updates. We have a ton of people doing incredible work across every single sport you could think of, all the way down to boxing and fighting. So anything you want, you can find it on our pages. So definitely follow on all the social pages there. But thank you again for listening, and have a wonderful day.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day.